You step through golden doors and enter the grandest palace in all of Christendom. The polished marble floors shine like glass, catching the glow of 1,000 candle flames that flicker against walls decorated with priceless Oriental tapestries. The gentle sweep of silk gowns brushes past you, carrying the quiet promise of wealth and influence as ladies of the court glide by like figures from another world, their hands, heavy with jewels worth more than kingdoms, trail across surfaces of unimaginable value. The air feels charged, thick with the weight of centuries, heavy with the scent of roses and amber, alive with the pulse of supreme power. This is it, you tell yourself. The fairy tale made real, a storybook turned to flesh and stone. You inhale deeply, ready to drink in the majesty of royalty. And then your stomach tightens. That smell, a cloying sweetness of perfume, fighting desperately to cover something unmistakably human. Your eyes sting as the truth pierces the dream, seeping into your mind like poison slipping through silk. This is not the polished fantasy of Disney films or the romantic worlds of costume dramas. This is the raw reality of medieval and Renaissance royalty. Behind jeweled crowns and dazzling robes hid habits of hygiene that would make any modern person gag. The woman walking toward you in golden brocade, her sleeves dripping with pearls as large as robin's eggs, may command an empire stretching across continents, but she has not properly washed in months. The nobleman, bowing low before her, displaying all the grace of the court, controls armies powerful enough to crush cities, yet his unwashed body carries lice enough to infest a whole village. And that quiet lady in waiting, she lowers her gaze, pretending to be modest, when in truth she is holding her breath, praying not to inhale the queen's foul breath, strong enough to drop a horse at 20 paces. Welcome to the true royal court, a place where power was absolute, but soap was optional, where the so-called divine right of kings meant never apologizing for reeking of sweat, where the idea that cleanliness is next to godliness was not just false, it was considered dangerous heresy. You have just entered a world where the most powerful women alive lived in conditions of filth that would shock even a modern homeless shelter, where beauty treatments were laced with poison, and where the chase for elegance turned royals into suffering monuments of vanity that strain belief. Before we explore these forgotten stories of survival and misery, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden sides of history, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. And please leave a comment sharing where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we can uncover these old truths together while sitting in different corners of the world, connected across time by our shared curiosity about the past. It's 1580, and you are a servant in the court of Queen Elizabeth. Dawn rises over Greenwich Palace, and you are given the most dreaded task in all England, preparing Her Majesty's monthly bath. Yes, monthly, the most powerful woman on earth, ruler of a kingdom whose wealth could buy entire nations, bathed only once a month. Even then, medical experts warned that this was far too often. 20 servants carry bucket after bucket of hot water from the kitchens, where fires have burned since midnight. A wooden tub waits, padded with fine linen to keep splinters from touching royal skin. But the real horror is yet to come. Elizabeth applied Venetian ceruse, a lead-based cosmetic that whitened the skin every day without ever washing off the old layers. As you help the queen disrobe, the scale of it hits you. Her face is a cracked mask of white, built up into hardened layers, vanity and poison fused into a second skin. When she finally lowers herself into the bath, the water darkens instantly as weeks of makeup, sweat, and dirt dissolve. The toxic paint peels away in strips, like old plaster falling from a wall. The stench rising from that bath was beyond words. A sharp metallic note from the lead mixed with vinegar-based cosmetics clung to the steam, all of it blended with layers of human secretions left unwashed for months. The result was an assault on the senses strong enough to bring a grown man to his knees. As a servant, you were expected to stand nearby, loyal and steady, while your stomach twisted and your eyes watered. You would watch as flakes of dead skin floated to the surface, mingling with white lead residue and the brown stains of long embedded grime. Elizabeth I, like nearly every noblewoman and royal across Europe, relied on Venetian ceruse, a mixture of vinegar, water, and white lead. The true horror wasn't how thick it was, but how unrelenting. Day after day, new poison went on top of old, creating a mask that grew heavier and more toxic with time. In France, Marie Antoinette turned her monthly baths into public theater. She would slip into the tub wearing a full-length linen gown, surrounded by courtiers and attendants, sometimes even eating breakfast while soaking. Imagine it, the Queen of France sitting in her own filth, nibbling pastries while nobles exchanged polite remarks. The psychological toll was staggering. These women ruled nations and commanded armies, yet their skin itched constantly from toxins seeping through their pores. It wasn't the ordinary discomfort of being unwashed, but a deep, maddening irritation that never stopped. Elizabeth's scalp was a breeding ground of oils, flakes, and hairstyling residue. The lead destroyed her hair, forcing her into elaborate wigs that only worsened the problem. The saddest part is how these queens carried themselves with dignity in the midst of all this. They held audiences while resisting the urge to scratch. They made decisions that changed lives while enduring unending physical torment. They presented themselves as God's chosen representatives while slowly poisoning themselves, all for the sake of a beauty ideal they could never escape. Step inside Elizabeth Missy's private chambers, and the horror reveals itself in full. The Queen's pale, mask-like face was not mere makeup. It was a death mask, reapplied each morning over layers that had been building for weeks. Her mornings began with yesterday's lead paint, already cracked and flaking, clinging to her skin like dried mud. Her ladies-in-waiting arrived with a fresh batch of the same mixture: vinegar, water, and white lead, but washing the old layer away. Unthinkable. Water was seen as dangerous, so instead they brushed new poison over the old. Layer upon layer, the mask thickened. Over time, the lead seeped through her skin, poisoning her slowly. The symptoms crept in: mood swings, lapses in memory, sudden bursts of anger. Courtiers whispered about her temper, her forgetfulness, her unpredictability. They blamed the heavy burden of ruling, never suspecting the real cause: daily doses of poison in pursuit of a ghostly complexion. The smell alone was overwhelming. Lead carried a sharp metallic odor, sharpened by vinegar, mixed with the greasy buildup underneath. To speak with the queen up close, one had to breathe through the mouth just to avoid retching. The psychological impact was as brutal as the physical. Lead poisoning is known to trigger paranoia, confusion, and sudden rages, all of which courtiers observed but dared not name. Physically, the cycle fed itself. Lead stripped away her hair, so wigs became more elaborate. It discolored and puckered her skin, demanding even thicker coats of paint to hide the damage. It rotted her teeth, making her breath so revolting that courtiers learned to position themselves at just the right distance during audiences. Each solution made the situation worse, locking these queens in a vicious circle. This wasn't simple vanity, it was dependence. The paint gave them a fleeting sense of perfection, a pale glow that symbolized purity in a world obsessed with whiteness. But as with any addiction, tolerance grew. What started as a light coat became a suffocating mask. Their skin grew darker, sicker, and more scarred, forcing heavier applications. They became prisoners of their own reflection, slowly destroyed from the outside in. Women of immense power, undone by the very standard they were forced to uphold. In the 17th century, King James I of Britain was notorious for never bathing. The result was not just personal filth, but a palace-wide infestation that turned the royal household into a crawling nightmare. Rooms he frequented teemed with lice, and entire gatherings of the realm's most powerful figures became exercises in endurance, trying to keep still, trying not to scratch. Lady Anne Clifford once recorded that after visiting the king's chambers, she and her family found themselves all lousy simply from sitting in the chamber of Sir Thomas Erskine. Imagine the scene. You are a high-born noble, dressed in silks and jewels, taking your seat for an audience with the king. Within minutes, you feel the first telltale tickle on your skin, then another. Soon your body is alive with movement, parasites crawling from furniture, wall hangings, and the king himself. This wasn't just uncomfortable. Lice were deadly carriers. Body lice spread typhus, a disease that killed more soldiers than opens battle. These tiny creatures, feeding on royal blood, carried plague from person to person at the very top of society. Every handshake, every bow, every whispered exchange risked spreading lethal infection. James himself was famously slovenly. He wore the same garments for months on end, even sleeping in them. His hat stayed on his head 7 days a week until it literally disintegrated. Every piece of fabric on his body became a breeding ground for insects. His private rooms must have looked like something out of a horror story. Shadows moving in the corners, chairs that seemed alive with tiny writhing bodies, and the sound of scratching echoing through the very halls of power. The mental strain was unbearable. Imagine conducting high-level diplomacy while your skin crawls. Imagine standing in full royal regalia during a state ceremony while lice creep across your scalp. This wasn't just discomfort, it was torture. Court life became grotesque theater. Nobles bowed and curtsied with flawless grace, while secretly clawing at themselves. The gentle swish of silk gowns mingled with the faint rasp of fingernails against fabric, as courtiers fought in vain against their living tormentors. And women's hairstyles made it worse. Hair was combed, curled, and greased with bear or ox fat before being powdered into towering constructions. Without regular washing, these elaborate styles became warm, sticky ecosystems where insects thrived. Fashionable ladies carried long, elegant scratching tools, ivory or silver sticks tipped with little claws, to dig into their heads through the layers of hair and fat. This was daily reality. Elaborate hair sculptures, glistening with animal grease, crawling with parasites. The scratching sticks provided momentary relief, but the infestation never ended. What's most shocking is how normalized it all became. Court etiquette even developed rules for scratching, when it was acceptable, how it should be done, and the correct way to use scratching tools in public. The rulers of Europe, the most powerful people on earth, lived as walking insect colonies. They maintained their dignity, their ceremony, their rituals, while parasites feasted on them endlessly. The obsession with royal beauty reached its most tragic peak with the widespread use of Venetian ceruse across European courts. This was not ordinary makeup. It was poison, slowly eating away at the women who used it, turning queens into pale, ghost-like figures as their bodies and minds decayed. The formula was deceptively simple: finely ground white lead mixed with vinegar into a paste that dried into a chalk-white finish. But the ritual of applying it revealed the true nightmare. Noble women didn't reserve this for festivals or court appearances. They wore it every single day, layering it on top of old applications without washing. Over weeks, the mask grew thicker and heavier, a crust of toxins pressed into their skin. Imagine a queen's morning routine in the 16th century. She wakes with yesterday's paint cracked and peeling. Her ladies-in-waiting arrive, not with soap or water, but with another batch of lead paste. They smear new poison over old, building another layer onto a mask that never comes off. The queen would awaken each morning with yesterday's paint cracked and peeling from her face. Her ladies-in-waiting came forward, carrying brushes and that familiar white paste. They never washed her skin. Water was seen as dangerous. So instead they simply smoothed fresh poison on top of the old. With every day that passed, the mask grew heavier, so much so that it caused headaches and even strained the neck. The mental toll was devastating. Lead poisoning brings mood swings, paranoia, and memory loss. Courtiers noticed their queens growing more unpredictable. Sudden bursts of rage, unexplained sadness, or forgotten conversations. They blamed the pressures of rule, never realizing their sovereigns were slowly losing their grip under the weight of vanity. The physical effects turned royal life into a horror show. Lead caused severe hair loss, forcing women into elaborate wigs that only damaged the scalp further. It puckered and discolored the skin, requiring even thicker coats of makeup to cover the destruction. Worst of all, it rotted teeth and left breath so vile that courtiers stood at carefully measured distances, close enough to hear their monarch's words, far enough to avoid gagging. It was a vicious cycle. Each new layer of paint gave only a fleeting sense of perfection. That pale, ghostly glow equated with divine purity. But as the skin beneath broke down, women applied more and more, trying desperately to hide the damage. What began as a light cosmetic dusting became suffocating masks. They were prisoners of their own reflections, trapped in a slow-motion death sentence. Even physicians of the age recognized the danger. Medical texts warned against lead-based cosmetics, listing symptoms we now know as heavy metal poisoning. Yet no amount of warning could fight the power of fashion. To abandon the pale mask was to abandon beauty itself. Queens chose to die slowly, beautifully, rather than live naturally. The final stages were unspeakable. Victims of advanced lead poisoning developed a grayish pallor that no powder could cover. Hair fell out in clumps, teeth blackened and dropped from their mouths. Their breath grew so offensive that even handkerchiefs drenched in perfume failed to hide it. And still, they went on painting their faces each morning. The most tragic part was their composure. These women held councils of state, while their skin cracked and flaked. They signed death warrants, while paranoia clouded their thoughts. They ruled nations, while their minds and bodies deteriorated, sacrificed on the altar of beauty. In the suffocating stench of unwashed royal courts, perfume was not a luxury. It was a weapon. Fragrance became chemical armor in a daily war against the smell of human decay. And the horror wasn't the perfumes themselves, but what they were trying, desperately, to cover up. At Versailles, more than 10,000 royals, courtiers, officials, servants, and soldiers lived together in the palace and its surrounding lodgings. Cleanliness was nearly non-existent. Women lifted their skirts to relieve themselves where they stood. Men urinated off the balustrade, even inside the royal chapel. The stench was so overwhelming that entire court culture grew around masking. It taught queens and noblewomen clutched perfumed sachets at their noses, not as fashion statements, but as survival tools. Gloves were soaked in fragrance, leaving scented trails wherever they walked. Hair was drenched with oil so strong they could be detected across a crowded room. But behind this aromatic armor was the truth. Unwashed bodies, rotting teeth, and clothing that had not seen water in months. Elizabeth I understood the importance of her public image. Her court was filled with a sense of flowers, musk, and amber. But this wasn't indulgence. It was necessity. Without it, courtiers might literally faint during audiences. The irony was that perfume often made matters worse. Applied over layers of sweat and filth, fragrances mixed with body oils, turning into nauseating cocktails. Imagine rose oil clinging to weeks-old perspiration, or ambergris layered over the metallic tang of festering wounds. The result was often more sickening than the stench it tried to hide. Court perfumers became battlefield commanders in this olfactory war. They created mixtures strong enough to drown out human odor, not enhance it. Recipes called for musk, ambergris, and civet, animal secretions so pungent they could be smelled from far away. These were not delicate perfumes, but olfactory hammers, designed to bludgeon the nose into numbness. The psychological toll was real. Nobles grew paranoid about their own scent, constantly sniffing and reapplying perfumes throughout the day. Entire codes of etiquette developed around fragrance. Certain smells signaled rank, alliances, even political positions. Others used scents as secret signals for romance, while some warned of sickness or political disgrace. Over time, an entire social ranking system developed based on smell. The stronger and more expensive your perfume, the higher your standing. Nobles who couldn't afford the most powerful fragrances were pushed aside, literally standing on the edges of gatherings where their weaker scent armor left them open to ridicule and exclusion. Women's fashion also adapted to this obsession. Dresses were designed not just for looks, but as perfume delivery systems. Hidden sachets and compartments were sewn into gowns. Sleeves contained small reservoirs of scented oils that released a fragrance with every movement. Even jewelry was crafted with hollow spaces to hold perfumed wax, which slowly melted from body heat, releasing a constant flow of aroma. But the saddest part is that all of this effort didn't solve the problem. It only covered it up. Instead of facing the reality of poor hygiene, the royal courts launched themselves into what became a perfume arms race. Every year, new, stronger fragrances were created to drown out the previous season's stench. The result was suffocating. The air in palaces turned into a thick, choking mixture of competing scents, layered on top of the natural smell of unwashed bodies and decay. Travelers often wrote about splitting headaches, nausea, and breathing problems after spending just a short time in these perfume-heavy halls. Yet courtiers preferred that misery over the far worse alternative. Breathing in the raw stench of royal life, this next part may shock you. It completely overturns what most people think about status, dignity, and power in the Middle Ages. In England, one of the most prestigious jobs at court wasn't commanding an army or running the treasury. It was being the king's personal toilet attendant. The official title was groom of the king's close stool. If you were lucky enough, though the word is used here with deep irony, the king might choose you for this role. Your main duty was to carry the king's portable toilet and clean him afterward. But it wasn't just about wiping up after bathroom visits. This role was about extreme intimacy, trust, and political influence. The groom personally handled the king's waist, cleaned his body with rough cloths or bare hands, and managed his most private needs, all while maintaining the strict formality of court life. They were, in effect, human toilet paper for rulers who believed they had been chosen by God. Now, imagine doing this under a monarch who rarely bathed, ate endless amounts of meat that rotted in his gut, and suffered from infections and open sores that festered for months. Each day began with the knowledge that you'd soon be kneeling behind the most powerful man in the country, breathing in the overpowering smell of his bowels mixed with disease and sweat, while scraping filth from a body that hadn't touched soap in weeks. And yet, this job came with enormous influence. The groom of the stool often became one of the king's closest confidants, privy to secrets that even generals and ministers never heard. Many of them rose to high positions in government, shaping policy at the very top. The act itself might have been degrading, but the access it granted to the king made it one of the most politically powerful positions in the kingdom. Of course, the psychological strain must have been extreme. day after day, dealing with the filth, the infections, the smell that would overwhelm even the strongest stomach. Yet these men endured it because proximity to the king meant power, and power was worth almost any humiliation. It wasn't just the waste itself. The air around the king was often a sickening mix of fecal matter, infected sores, unwashed skin, rotting clothes, and heavy perfumes that only made things worse. And yet, the groom had to remain perfectly composed, answer questions, give advice, and never once let his face betray disgust. What makes this even more unsettling is that many of these men formed real emotional bonds with the kings they served. They were the first to notice when the monarch was unwell. They understood his physical weaknesses in detail, and they studied his bodily functions with almost scientific precision. That knowledge gave them political leverage. They became walking diaries of royal decay, confidants to bodies that were falling apart under the weight of absolute power. Kings often carried out state business while seated on their close stool. Treaties were discussed, wars declared, and death sentences signed in rooms that reeked of human waste, while the groom knelt only a few feet away, cloth in hand. Some of the most pivotal conversations in English history happened in that environment, with one man cleaning another's unwashed backside. The power dynamics were striking. For all his authority, the king was at his most helpless in those moments, completely dependent on the groom for comfort and dignity. That intimate knowledge, when the king struggled, when he bled, when he cried out in pain, became a form of political currency. It could open doors, win allies, and influence decisions at the very heart of the court. The position often stayed in families, passed from father to son, creating dynasties of toilet attendants who built wealth and influence generation after generation. These families knew not just the kingdom's political secrets, but its most private medical ones. Which kings had chronic diarrhea, which suffered from bleeding hemorrhoids, which groaned in agony each time they relieved themselves. Perhaps the most disturbing part is how normal this became. In a twisted reversal of dignity, young men competed for the honor of cleaning royal filth, while parents proudly hoped their sons would one day be chosen. Handling the king's excrement was not seen as shameful, but as a symbol of success and access to power. Over time, grooms developed specialized skills for their strange profession. They used different cloths for different tasks, learned to anticipate the king's bodily schedule, and studied which foods caused the most trouble for his digestion. In many ways, they became unofficial doctors, spotting early signs of illness, recommending diet changes, or adjusting schedules to match the king's stomach troubles. Their observations could even influence matters as serious as succession planning if the monarch's health was in question. The psychological burden of such a role must have been crushing. Imagine living each day in that environment, defined by smells, waste, and sickness, yet expected to carry yourself as a trusted statesman. History rarely speaks of the toll it took, but it is impossible to imagine it left no scars. They spent their entire lives serving the most degrading aspects of human existence, yet were expected to show dignity, loyalty, and absolute discretion. These men knew more about their king's body than his physicians or even his wife, but they could never reveal what they witnessed. Their power came from a position that looked powerless, kneeling in filth, while the fate of nations was decided only inches away. One of the most disturbing examples of hygiene and power comes from Queen Isabella of Castile. Here, dirt itself was transformed into a form of religious devotion. Cleanliness was rebranded as sin, and bathing could cost you your life. Entire cultures were destroyed under the belief that soap was a tool of the devil. While it's likely exaggerated that Isabella only bathed twice in her lifetime, the persecution of hygiene under her reign is well documented and terrifying. Spain built a system where washing was seen as rebellion against God, and filth was treated as proof of faith. Imagine living in 15th century Spain. The most powerful woman in the kingdom has declared that washing your body is an offense against Christ. Priests preach that dirt carries divine grace, and that suffering through stench and grime brings you closer to the suffering of the cross. Under this twisted logic, bathing wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. After the conquest of Granada, Spain's Muslims weren't only forced to abandon their faith, they were forbidden from bathing. Public baths were demolished, soap was outlawed, and personal cleanliness became evidence of heresy. To wash your face, to wear clean clothes, or to be caught with soap could mean being burned alive. The Inquisition turned hygiene into a crime. Inspectors searched homes for signs of bathing, questioned neighbors about suspicious washing, and even interrogated servants about their master's habits. Children were encouraged to report on parents who seemed too clean. A simple bucket of water could end an entire family. The obsession went beyond Spain itself. When Columbus described the daily bathing habits of the native peoples of the Bahamas and Caribbean, Isabella was horrified. She immediately ordered them to stop. Clean, healthy, indigenous communities who had protected themselves from disease for centuries through daily washing were forced to abandon their practices. Instead of learning from this superior hygiene, the Spanish branded it blasphemy and tore down the systems that sustained it. The results were catastrophic. European soldiers, unwashed for months and carrying new diseases, infected native populations who were no longer allowed to protect themselves with their traditional rituals of cleanliness. Parents watched children die from illnesses that could have been prevented with a simple bath, while priests told them this suffering was God's will. The Spanish even codified this filth into law. Purity of blood regulations weren't only about religion or ancestry. They extended to hygiene. Families had to prove not just Christian heritage, but Christian uncleanliness. Genealogical records noted bathing habits, and being descended from people who washed regularly could disqualify you from positions of honor or even mark you for persecution. Worst of all, this anti-hygiene ideology spread far beyond Spain, from Mexico to Peru, from the Philippines to the Caribbean. The Spanish colonial system attacked local bathing traditions and replaced them with European filth. Practices that had kept communities clean and healthy for generations were destroyed, all in the name of purity. Cleanliness itself had been criminalized, and entire civilizations paid the price. Ancient aqueducts were left to crumble, public baths were destroyed, and traditional cleansing rituals were outlawed under penalty of death. The medical fallout was devastating. Diseases once kept under control by basic hygiene, typhus, dysentery, and chronic skin infections, spread unchecked throughout Spain and its colonies. Communities that had once been healthy were now overwhelmed by sickness. In effect, the Spanish had created biological warfare against their own people, with filth as the weapon. The belief system behind this horror was rooted in Christian theology of the time. Cleanliness was seen as vanity, and vanity was a sin. Suffering, on the other hand, was viewed as purification. The more one endured physical discomfort, the closer one was believed to be to Christ. This created a twisted logic where making yourself sick became proof of devotion. Royal courts turned this into a competition of suffering. Nobles prided themselves on how long they could go without bathing, how unbearable their body odor was, or how many skin diseases and parasites they could endure. What began as religious policy turned into a social contest of deliberate self-destruction. The consequences lasted for centuries. Colonization spread this anti-hygiene ideology far beyond Spain. Everywhere the Spanish went, they dismantled local systems of health, knowledge of medicinal bathing, therapeutic washing, and preventive cleanliness, developed over millennia by civilizations across the world, was actively suppressed and erased. This stands as one of history's greatest reversals of progress. While Islamic societies, Asian cultures, and indigenous peoples had developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to hygiene and public health, Christian Europe was moving in the opposite direction, treating cleanliness as sin and elevating suffering as virtue. Now, picture a scene that reveals the grotesque psychology of privilege disguised as charity. Countess Platen of Hanover reclines in a tub filled with warm milk. Her body is ravaged by disease, almost certainly syphilis, the scourge that tore through Europe's nobility like divine punishment for centuries of unchecked excess. This is no beauty ritual. The Countess's skin is eaten away by sores. Infection has likely disfigured her face, leaving her nose destroyed, her breath foul with rot. The milk bath is nothing more than a desperate attempt to soothe skin that feels as if it's burning from within, a brief escape from the agony of advanced venereal disease. And then comes the most chilling detail. After soaking in the milk, she ordered it given to the poor. The cruelty is almost beyond belief. Here was a woman so diseased that her very presence risked infecting others. Yet she chose to turn her bathwater into charity, sending liquid steeped in her infected body fluids into the homes of peasants. Now imagine being one of those families. You're starving, your children are thin from hunger, and winter looms. Then a servant from the noble household arrives with what looks like salvation, fresh milk from the Countess herself. You accept it with gratitude, perhaps even thanking God for her generosity. You don't know that this gift is contaminated. You can't see the invisible pathogens now swirling in the liquid. You feed your children what you believe is life-giving nourishment, never realizing it carries the disease of a dying noblewoman. You don't realize that this so-called act of charity was actually a way of spreading disease from the palace into the poorest areas of the city. What looked like kindness was, in fact, a hidden death sentence. The Countess herself probably believed she was doing her Christian duty, but her mind was already damaged by the effects of advanced syphilis. In her thinking, she was simply sharing what she had with those who had less. The fact that what she was sharing was contaminated with her own infected bodily fluids didn't matter in the moral logic of her time. She had more than she needed. The poor had less, so giving was considered good, no matter the consequences. This shows how disconnected the nobility were from common humanity. For the Countess, her personal comfort mattered more than the lives of hundreds of poor families. The thought that her bathing habits might kill innocent people never entered her mind. To her, the poor had so little value that their suffering did not count compared to her brief relief from pain. And this wasn't just one woman's cruelty. It was part of a much larger pattern in royal courts across Europe. Disease was constantly passed down from infected nobles to the ordinary people who served them. Contaminated food cooked by diseased royal chefs, clothing handed down from sick nobles, communion wine shared by clergy with infections, even forced sexual encounters between sick royals and powerless servants. All of these spread illness through entire communities. The courts became, without realizing it, centers of biological warfare, weddings where diseased nobles shared food with hundreds of guests, religious services where sick priests handled communion items that touched countless mouths, public gatherings where royalty handed out blessed objects that carried deadly infections from the palace into villages and towns. For the poor who received this charity, the truth was devastating. Families that once praised the Countess's generosity, even thanking God for her kindness, later faced the horror of watching their children die from diseases contracted through her milk. The same act they believed was noble and holy turned out to be the very thing that killed their loved ones. What looked like virtue was, in reality, murder disguised as charity. Even worse, this wasn't an isolated case. The same thing kept happening generation after generation. Records show other nobles gave away infected food, diseased animals, and contaminated clothing to poor families. Either they never understood that their illnesses could spread, or they simply didn't care enough about common people to worry about the consequences. Medical ignorance played a role, but it wasn't the only reason. Some court doctors did understand how diseases spread and even tried to warn against these practices, but their advice was ignored whenever it clashed with noble vanity or convenience. The desire of the nobility to appear generous mattered more than the health of the poor, and so acts of giving often turned into acts of mass killing. This was the ultimate corruption of Christian charity. What was supposed to be kindness became a weapon of death. What should have been an act of compassion became a way of spreading disease. The Countess likely died, believing she had lived a virtuous and generous life, but the reality is that her so-called charity killed more people than any act of open cruelty ever could. The elaborate hairstyles of royal women were not just fashion. They were breeding grounds of dirt, decay, and living parasites that today would make anyone gag and run from the room. These massive hair designs were biological disasters that turned heads into nests of creatures feeding on their flesh. Even as the women carried themselves with elegance in public. Hair was combed, curled, coated with bear or ox fat, mixed with resin, and then powdered. With no bathing and little hygiene, fleas were everywhere. Some women carried long, thin sticks with small claws at the end just to scratch their itchy scalps. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare of royal hair care in the medieval and Renaissance courts. Imagine the daily process of building these enormous, towering hairstyles. The process began before sunrise, when unlucky servants assigned to hair duty got to work. Whatever remained of the queen's natural hair, already damaged from months of harsh chemicals and crawling with parasites, was first coated in animal fat, rendered in the palace kitchens from bear or ox carcasses. This wasn't anything close to modern cosmetic oils. It was thick, greasy sludge that smelled and felt like decaying meat. The odor was overpowering. Fresh fat already has a sharp, sickening smell, but once it aged and turned rancid, the stench became unbearable. Mixed with unwashed hair that hadn't been cleaned for weeks, layered with leftover residue from earlier styles, and heated by body warmth, it created a smell so brutal that it could make a healthy adult gag and collapse. And that was just the smell. The rancid fat acted like bait for every insect in the area, turning the queen's head into a permanent nest. Fleas, lice, ticks, and even flying insects flocked to the warm, greasy surface. They didn't just land and leave. They stayed, bred, and multiplied, transforming the royal coiffure into a thriving insect colony. These bugs weren't passive passengers. They were fully active residents in this grotesque ecosystem. Fleas laid eggs directly in the fat, which served both as a food source and as a nursery. Lice burrowed into the mix of grease and dead skin, carving out tunnels and chambers where they reproduced in safety. The queen's scalp itself became a maternity ward for parasites that fed on her blood day and night, during meals, state ceremonies, and even religious services. On top of this living mess, servants would apply powder, not for hygiene, but for appearance. The powder absorbed some grease and added fashionable color: blue, pink, gold, or the classic white. But instead of improving matters, it fused with the fat, insect droppings, and built up dirt. The result was a thick, plaster-like crust that hardened into a helmet of filth. Once set, it couldn't simply be washed away. Removing it often required cutting chunks of hair straight from the scalp, because it was so time-consuming and expensive to build these towering hairstyles. Women left them in place for weeks at a time. During those weeks, the infestation only grew. Dead insects piled up, creating food for other scavenger insects. Layer after layer of decay developed until the queen's hair hosted a complete food chain, with parasites, predators, and decomposers all thriving in the same compact space. The psychological burden was just as horrifying as the physical one. These women were forced to maintain calm expressions and royal dignity, while their scalps never stopped crawling with life. The biting, the itching, the constant writhing never ended. To cope, noble women carried special tools: long, slender sticks made of ivory or silver, often decorated with jewels to match their gowns. With these, They could discreetly scratch at the agony beneath the towering hair structures, buying themselves a few moments of relief before the torment resumed. Imagine trying to lead a diplomatic meeting while parasites literally chewed away at your scalp. Picture standing through a solemn religious service, expected to radiate grace and dignity, while insects crept across your forehead and crawled down your neck. These women had to smile, nod, and speak as if nothing was wrong, fighting the relentless urge to rip apart their towering hairstyles and scratch until they bled. Creating these structures took anywhere from 6 to 8 hours, and once finished, they were often left untouched for 2 to 3 weeks. During that time, the hair beneath would knot and tangle into solid mats, forming an even better breeding ground for insects and bacteria. Some women lost their natural hair permanently, left with bald patches where the weight of the style and the endless insect activity destroyed the follicles. Others developed ongoing scalp infections, open sores that oozed and drew in even more parasites. The smell was its own nightmare. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was overpowering. The stench that radiated from these hairstyles was so intense that courtiers created unspoken rules for how to survive it. Everyone knew to stand upwind of the queen whenever possible. They learned to breathe through their mouths during private conversations, and many carried perfumed handkerchiefs to press discreetly against their noses when the odor grew unbearable. What made this even more disturbing was how it was glorified. Instead of being seen as a crisis, this was celebrated as high fashion. The bigger the hair, the stronger the stench, the more vermin it could support, the higher your social standing. Noble women competed to build the tallest, most elaborate, most parasite-ridden hairstyles in the kingdom. What should have been recognized as filth and decay became a contest of vanity. Constructing these towering hairpieces required whole teams of servants who risked their own health in the process. Stylists often worked in shifts because the stench and constant crawling of insects made it hard to stay at the task for long. Exposure led to nausea, breathing problems, and sometimes parasitic infections of their own. To cope, they developed specialized tools, methods to work around the worst clusters of bugs, and strategies to finish their work quickly, just to minimize the suffering. The saddest part is that many women knew how disgusting and unhealthy this was. Private letters from noble ladies reveal their frustration and even shame. They described the endless itching, the foul odor, and their longing for simpler, cleaner forms of beauty. But they couldn't escape the crushing weight of fashion and expectation. At court, appearance mattered more than health. Status came before comfort, and social pressure demanded that they sacrifice basic dignity for the sake of style. The most shocking story of royal hygiene comes from Louis XIV's Versailles, where the Sun King's decision to gather his entire court in one place turned the palace into one of the filthiest environments in European history. Versailles may have sparkled with gold, mirrors, and artwork, but beneath that brilliance, it was a cesspit of waste and disease. At its peak, over 10,000 royals, aristocrats, officials, servants, and soldiers lived in Versailles and its nearby lodgings. That many people in one palace created an avalanche of human waste and rot that overwhelmed every possible means of sanitation. For all its magnificence, life at Versailles was no cleaner than the worst European slums. Women lifted their skirts and relieved themselves right where they stood. Men urinated off balconies, even inside the royal chapel. This wasn't a rare act of desperation. It was the accepted, everyday way of handling bodily needs in a palace, housing more people than most cities, yet with almost no functional toilets. Now picture this. You're walking through the most famous palace in the world. At the height of its glory, golden walls shimmer in candlelight. Priceless art covers the walls. Mirrors reflect endless visions of luxury and power. And yet, your shoes squelch through puddles of urine, soaking into carpets worth a fortune. The sound of trickling liquid echoes in corridors as courtiers casually relieve themselves wherever they stand. The stench at Versailles was beyond imagination. Expensive perfumes mixed with the reek of human waste to create a choking, eye-watering fog that no one could truly escape. Historian Tony Spawforth even records an almost unbelievable event. Marie Antoinette herself was once struck by human waste thrown from a palace window as she crossed an interior courtyard. Think about that. France's queen, dressed in silks and jewels, worth more than some entire provinces, walking with her usual royal dignity, when suddenly excrement comes raining down onto her gown. And this wasn't some bizarre accident. It was normal life. At Versailles, people regularly tossed their waste out of windows because there was simply nowhere else for it to go. That was the daily reality in what was supposed to be Europe's most magnificent palace. The truth is, Versailles was never designed to house the 10,000 people Louis XIV forced to live there when he moved his entire court permanently into the palace. The infrastructure collapsed under the sheer weight of human needs. Toilets overflowed constantly. Latrines leaked through the ceilings into the bedrooms below, and the palace's iron and lead pipes regularly corroded and blocked. In some cases, these breakdowns even poisoned food prepared in Marie Antoinette's kitchens. Imagine it. You're the Queen of France, presiding over lavish banquets designed to show off the glory of your dynasty, and while your guests dine under gilded ceilings, sewage is literally dripping from above onto the tables, spoiling the food and tainting the air. That was Versailles in its golden age, opulence layered over filth. The psychological toll must have been immense. Everyone was forced to maintain the illusion that this was the pinnacle of civilization, even as they lived surrounded by human waste. Not even the royal nursery was spared. As Spawforth describes, the children of France, future kings and queens, grew up in an environment that was equal parts palace and cesspit. They learned to walk by dodging puddles of urine and excrement in the corridors. They played games while breathing air heavy with the stench of 10,000 people's unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps, infected wounds, and constant human waste. The smell alone defies description. With such a massive population and only primitive sewage systems that frequently clogged or overflowed, Versailles was an olfactory hell. Breathing wasn't automatic. It was an act of mental preparation, of forcing yourself to endure what your senses screamed was unbearable. But the real horror went deeper than just the physical filth. It was psychological. The court lived in a contradiction, surrounded by unimaginable luxury, yet drowning in squalor, forced to pretend that this nightmare represented the height of refinement and civilization. Versailles was supposed to be the jewel of Europe, the center of civilization, the model of refinement, the earthly symbol of divine order. Ambassadors came from across the world, expecting to see French brilliance at its finest. What they actually found was a nightmare, human waste in every corridor, courtiers who hadn't bathed in months, and conversations with diplomats whose foul breath could knock a person back. To survive, the palace elite developed coping mechanisms that reveal just how far people can adapt to horror. Courtiers mapped out the safest areas where waste was less likely to pile up. They invented codes to warn each other about new deposits of excrement. They learned how to walk in specific ways to avoid stepping in filth, how to stand during ceremonies to escape the worst stench, and even how to breathe in shallow, careful patterns to minimize exposure to toxic air. Etiquette itself changed to match the reality of Versailles. There were accepted methods for relieving yourself during royal audiences, recognized corners of chapels where men could urinate without breaking ceremony, and even protocols for how to react if a puddle of waste interrupted a formal procession. The most sophisticated court in Europe reorganized its social life around sewage management. Fashion also adapted. Women's towering gowns weren't just about beauty and status. They doubled as waste disposal systems. The multiple layers of skirts and petticoats absorbed urine when ladies relieved themselves in public, soaking up the liquid and spreading contamination as they moved about the palace. Clothing became part of Versailles' sewage network, distributing filth across carpets, furniture, and banquet halls. The most disturbing part was how children raised in this environment came to see it as completely normal. Young nobles who grew up at Versailles believed that living in filth was simply the way life worked. They had no concept of sanitation because they had never experienced it. When they finally left the palace, many were shocked to discover cleaner environments elsewhere. The health consequences were exactly what you'd expect. Diseases that spread through fecal contamination, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, tore through the court in waves, killing both nobles and servants. But instead of tackling the obvious sanitation crisis, physicians blamed bad air, moral failings, or divine punishment. Servants bore the brunt of this misery. Cleaning staff worked in conditions so toxic that many developed permanent lung damage and chronic illness. Their task was to keep the palace looking magnificent while surrounded by human waste, rotting food, and contagious disease. For many, leaving wasn't an option. Royal service was their only path to survival, no matter how degrading it became. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that this disaster became a blueprint. Other monarchs visited Versailles, dazzled by its grandeur, and returned home determined to copy it. Without realizing it, they imported not just the glittering architecture, but the filth, disease, and unsanitary lifestyle that went with it. Across Europe, palaces became networks of royal cesspits, competing in luxury while drowning in their own waste. And what of Louis XIV himself, the Sun King who had made Versailles the stage for his glory? he lived in the very environment he had created, a monument to power built on unimaginable filth. Historical accounts rarely discuss his personal feelings, but one can only imagine the psychological strain of ruling a kingdom while surrounded every day by the reek and rot of his own masterpiece. Louis XIV himself breathed the same poisoned air as everyone else. He smelled the same unbearable stench and lived through the same humiliation. In chasing absolute control, he had locked himself inside a palace that was, in truth, a prison of waste. He could never admit to this failure, because doing so would have shattered the image of power he fought so hard to create. Versailles became the ultimate symbol of contradiction. On the outside, it appeared to be the height of beauty and order, yet inside it was a nightmare of filth and disease that warped the minds of those forced to live there. This gulf between royal image and royal reality ran through the entire Ancien regime. In paintings and official accounts, Versailles shone with glory, but the daily life inside its walls was closer to biological torture. That crushing contradiction between what the monarchy claimed to represent and the squalor it actually lived in laid the psychological groundwork for revolution. When ordinary people finally saw that their superior rulers lived like caged animals in golden rooms smeared with their own waste, the myth of royal divinity collapsed. Stepping back from these glimpses of royal life, one fact becomes impossible: to ignore the fairy tale of spotless, graceful kings and queens was never real. It was propaganda written by people who never endured the misery. The truth is not about glamorous figures in elegant clothes. It is about human beings trapped in grotesque conditions created by vanity, ceremony, and blind tradition. These living environments would today be judged as cruel and inhumane punishment. The queens and noble ladies of Versailles were not villains. They were captives of a system that demanded beauty over health, ritual over comfort, and status over dignity. Their existence was marked by constant discomfort, the kind that would drive a modern person to madness. Yet they kept their composure, performed their roles, governed kingdoms, and influenced history, all while infested with insects, scratching at their scalps, and slowly poisoning themselves with their own beauty practices. So when you finish this and return to the comfort of clean water, fresh air, and soap, remember the women behind the crowns. They were not fairy tale characters, but real people. People trapped by the accident of birth in palaces that were in truth prisons of filth. They carried themselves with grace, even as their bodies failed them day after day, year after year, until death was the only escape from the golden nightmare they could never leave.